My name's Stuart Sorensen, and this is the God-Free Guide. And I'd like to spend a few moments just explaining to you why I've chosen to start this blog and video channel. You see, I wasn't always an atheist. I was christened as a baby into the Church of England, and I was brought up an Anglican, and actually got confirmed, as Anglicans do, at the age of about 12 or 13. And it was only after that, when tragedy hit my life, that I began to question and very quickly became an atheist, certainly by the time I was about 14, without ever really having thought about religious issues one way or the other, to be honest. I just decided I didn't believe. And then when I was 17, as often happens with young men, I met my first proper love. We were together for about 18 months and we split up over something very trivial. I don't really know what it was now, but the result was that at 18 I was what I now recognise to be clinically depressed and utterly devastated at the breakup of the relationship which actually was my first love. And that's when the bastards got me. I was desperate. I was desolate. I felt alone. And I really needed to feel a sense of belonging. And the Pentecostal church offered me just that. I had this ready-made family of caring, welcoming people who seemed to like me for me. And all I had to do to be part of this club was pay the price of admission, which is belief. I had to deny evolution, for example. I had to believe in the creation story of the Old Testament. And the human mind being what it is, I managed to do that. I had to prevent myself from asking what I now consider to be very reasonable questions. I had to self-censor, and as long as I did all this, I could continue to be part of this club, and I could have that sense of fellowship, of belonging. And they kept me for 10 years. They kept me until, funnily enough, the end of another relationship. This time I was engaged, I was a student nurse, as was she. We both were training in the same place in the British Midlands, and we split up. She made an allegation about me after we'd split. It wasn't true, and actually after about a year she got drunk and admitted it wasn't true. But for that year I was ostracised by almost the entire student body and also by the members of my church. You see, the elders had prayed for guidance to the Holy Spirit. They had asked the Spirit to let them know whether or not the allegation was true, and the Spirit apparently had told them it was. So I was ostracised from church as well. That hurt me immensely, but it did something really very beneficial as well. You see, I no longer had to pay the price of admission because I wasn't in the club anyway, so after 10 years I could stop self-censoring. I allowed myself to ask the difficult questions. The questions that, had I allowed myself to ask right at the start, I'd have spent about 10 minutes in that church. But no, I was desperate. I was what we used to call, in my evangelistic days, ripe for harvest. But at 27, as a student nurse who'd just been not quite disfellowshipped, but certainly made unwelcome in my church, I allowed myself to ask the questions. And the first question I asked was not about the elders of the church or the congregation, because God, if God exists, is bigger than the elders. My question was, how could the Holy Spirit mislead people like that? How could a loving God allow such an injustice? And I could find no good answer to that question. But still I believed in God. But the more I considered the information I read, remember, I was a very devout Christian for about 10 years. I read a chapter of the Bible a day. By the end of it, I was in church or house group or in private prayer at least 6 days every week. I was right there. And I had a lot of information. So I began to review that information. I began to review the genocides in the Old Testament. I reviewed the story of Job, who underwent such awful trials and tribulations simply because of an arrogant desire on God's part to prove how good he was. Basically, Job suffered for a bet. I looked at the story of the crucifixion and began to ask myself interesting questions like, is it possible for someone else to pay my debt? Where does that debt come from in the first place? And of course, it comes from the fall in the Garden of Eden, which basically means that I am damned because of something that somebody else did. And that makes no sense, coming from apparently a loving God. There are lots of questions that I ask, questions which throughout the course of the life of this channel we'll get to and we'll answer. But I came to the conclusion that God was a monster, and that I could not, in all conscience, worship a monster. I have too much integrity for that. Well, it took me about 2 years to get through the fear of hell that engendered. I was convinced that at the end of my life I would be burning in the fires of hell for all eternity. That's not a prospect I relished, but I could not allow myself to let my integrity go by worshipping the monster that is the Abrahamic God. As I say, I spent 2 years terrified of damnation until almost overnight, eventually, or it felt like almost overnight. It was actually a 2-year process, but what felt like almost overnight, the 2 years of thinking and reflection just seemed to hit that critical mass, that tipping point, and I realized there is no God. And if there's no God, there's no hell. And if there's no hell, I don't need to worry about it. But I realized something else. My reflection in those 2 years had meant that I'd gone from that simplistic Christian morality, where you don't so much work out what's right. There's nothing ethical in Christianity. You simply follow rules, some of which are incredibly silly. And I realized that my morality over those 2 years had become significantly more developed than anything you'll find in the Bible, Old or New Testament. We'll talk at some point about the Beatitudes, which many people say is the clear and obvious illustration of Jesus Christ's advanced morality. Well, we'll unpick that one day, because there's nothing particularly advanced about it, and in many ways the advice in it is ridiculous in the extreme. But back to my deconversion story. Once I realized that there was no God and that my morality was superior, to the morality I'd been taught by old men in pulpits, I began to relabel everything. I reviewed my whole life, my whole society. I reviewed my place in the world. That took another year or so. Which means that now, at the age of 57, I have spent 30 years since being a Christian and 27 years happier, wiser, more moral and more ethical than I ever was as a Christian. And I'll tell you something else. If you ever want to understand why you should not be a Christian, read the Bible. Read it with an open mind and actually think about what it says. But if you don't want to do that, and I promise you it's not a good read, I've read it a few times over the years I was a Christian and I still dip into it occasionally now. If you don't want to do that, just subscribe to the channel. We'll get to all the meaningful bits over time and hopefully have some interesting discussions too. My name is Stuart Sorensen, this is the God-Free Guide. Please like and subscribe and leave some comments in the channel, in the comments section. Let me know what you think and any questions you have, any statements, any comments. I'll be more than happy to receive them, and assuming they're not just abuse from believers, I've had my fill of that, I'll respond. Cheers. Thanks for listening.